Hello and welcome to the next episode of East Meets Swiss. There is something about open source software that I still find difficult to fully understand. And maybe that is exactly why I find it so fascinating. Imagine telling someone, I'm going to spend my evening programming. I might spend 5 hours fixing a bug. Nobody asked me to do it. Nobody is necessarily going to pay me for it. And when I'm finished, I'm going to make the result available to other people. People I don't know. People living in countries I never visited. People who might have even taken my work, change it, improve it, and use it to build something completely different. Why would anyone do that? And yet, this is not some small idealistic experiment. Open source software has become part of the technological foundation of our world. Linux is probably the most famous example. Today, Linux is used in servers, cloud infrastructure, supercomputers, embedded systems, networking equipment, and countless industrial applications. Corporations worth billions depend on technologies that grew out of open collaboration. And that raises a fascinating question. How did we get there here? And perhaps an even more interesting question, what does open source tell us about human beings? Linux began in 1991. A young Finnish computer science student named Linus Torvalds started working on his own operating system kernel. At first, this was not a plan to change the world. It was a personal project. Torvalds wanted to experiment and learn, but instead of keeping his work private, he shared it with others. People started looking at the code. Some found problems. Some suggested improvements. Some wrote additional functionality. And gradually, something unusual happened. The project stopped being only the work of one person. It became the work of a community. Of course, Linux itself did not appear from nowhere. There was already a much larger free software movement. People such as Richard Stallman had argued years earlier that users should have the freedom to study software, modify it, and share it. Projects such as GNU had already created many of the tools that would later be combined with the Linux kernel. So Linux became a part of a much larger idea. Software could be something that people developed together, and the source code could be accessible. That sounds almost normal today, but think about what that means. Traditionally, when a company develops a product, the company owns the product. The company decides what happens to it. The company controls the knowledge. Open source introduces a very different model. The knowledge itself can be shared. But why would people contribute? I think the first answer is probably the simplest. Because they are interested. Engineers like building things, programmers like solving problems, and sometimes the problem itself is the reward. If you have ever worked on something late into the evening simply because you wanted to understand why it wasn't working, you probably know this feeling. There is a certain satisfaction when something finally works, and that satisfaction exists independently of money. Psychologists sometimes call this intrinsic motivation. You do something because the activity itself is meaningful or enjoyable. And I think open source demonstrates how powerful intrinsic motivation can become when many people share it. But that is only one motivation. There is also learning. Imagine that you are a young software developer. You could build a project privately on your computer, or you could contribute to a real project being used by thousands or even millions of people. Your code might be reviewed by experienced engineers. Someone might tell you, this implementation is inefficient. This interface is confusing. This creates a security problem. Or simply, there is a much better way to do this. That feedback can be extremely valuable. So perhaps open source contribution is not really working for free. Maybe sometimes the compensation is knowledge. You contribute your time, and in return, you receive experience. There is another possible reward: reputation. If somebody contributes important work to a respected open source project, that contribution is visible. You can show what you have built. You can demonstrate that you understand the technology. You can show that you are able to work with other developers. And yes, that can help somebody find a job. So the motivation is not necessarily completely altruistic, and I don't think it needs to be. This is actually one of the things I find interesting about open source. Different motivations can coexist. One person contributes because they believe software should be free. Another contributes because they want to learn. Another wants recognition. Another wants to improve something they personally use. Another is actually being paid by a company to contribute. And another person might simply think, this bug annoys me. I'm going to fix it. All of these people can still work on the same project. Maybe successful cooperation doesn't require everybody to have the same motivation. Maybe it only requires their interests to overlap sufficiently. And this becomes even more interesting when we look at corporations. Because today open source is certainly not just a collection of volunteers sitting at home in the evening. Companies employ developers specifically to work on open source software. Why would a corporation pay an engineer to develop something that competitors can also use? Because sometimes sharing the foundation is more efficient than building the foundation again and again. Imagine 10 companies all needing similar basic infrastructure. They could each build their own version. 10 teams, 10 implementations, 10 sets of bugs. Or they can contribute to a common technological foundation and compete somewhere else. That changes the meaning of competition. Companies don't necessarily have to compete at every layer. They can cooperate on the foundation and compete on the products and services built on top of it. I find that a very powerful idea. Cooperation and competition do not always have to be opposites. Sometimes cooperation actually makes competition possible. But there is another dimension of open source that fascinates me: borders. Imagine an open source project with a developer in Switzerland, another developer in China. Another one is in India. Another is in Brazil. Another is in the United States. Another is in Vietnam. They might have completely different political systems, different cultures, different religions, different languages, different ideas about society. They might never meet, and yet they can work on the same piece of software. The compiler does not care about nationality. The bug does not care about nationality. Either the code works or it doesn't. Of course, human communication is more complicated than that. There can be disagreements, there can be conflicts, there can be politics inside communities, but the common project creates something shared. And I think that is worth thinking about. Because much of human history has been organized around borders, countries, territories, institutions, companies. But open source communities can create another type of structure. A community organized around a problem, not around geography. Does that mean there are no rules? Absolutely not. This is an important distinction. Open source does not mean no rules. In fact, successful open source projects can have a very strong rules base. There are licenses, there are contributions, guidelines, there are maintainers, there are technical standards, there are processes for deciding which changes are accepted and which are rejected. And sometimes there are very strong personalities involved. So open source is not anarchy. It might actually demonstrate something almost opposite. Large scale voluntary cooperation requires governance. If everybody could change everything whenever they wanted, many projects would quickly become unusable. Freedom requires structure. And I find this very interesting because the same question exists in society. How much freedom should individuals have? Who creates the rules? Who can change them? Who decides whether a proposal is accepted? What happens when people disagree? These are political questions, but strangely enough, they are also software development questions. And this brings me to democracy. Is open source democratic? My answer would be sometimes. But necessarily, democracy usually means that political power ultimately comes from the people, and that citizens have mechanisms for participation and representation. Open source projects work differently. You usually don't have one person, one vote. An experienced maintainer may have much more influence than someone who arrived yesterday. And that might be completely reasonable. If somebody has spent 10 years understanding a system, perhaps their technical judgment could carry more weight. So open source is not the same thing as democracy, but I think they share some interesting principles. Transparency is one. In open source, you can often see the code, you can see discussions, you can see changes. You can sometimes see why decisions were made. Participation is another. If you have the necessary skills and follow the project's rules, you may be able to contribute. And there is another concept that I find especially interesting: the fork. If an open source community fundamentally disagrees about the direction of the project, somebody can sometimes take the existing code and create another version. Think about how radical that idea is. You can effectively say, I disagree with where this is going, so I will take what we have built and try another direction. Imagine having that possibility with every institution in society. Of course, society doesn't work like software. You cannot simply fork Switzerland or create Switzerland version 2.0 on GitHub. But as a thought experiment, it is fascinating. There is also an important warning here. We should not romanticize open source. Open communities are still human communities. There can be power struggles, there can be exclusion, there can be toxic communication. Important projects can become dependent on a very small number of maintainers. And sometimes critical software infrastructure is maintained by people who receive surprisingly little financial support. That creates risks. If the entire digital world depends on open infrastructure, somebody still needs to maintain that infrastructure. Freedom does not eliminate responsibility. So perhaps one of the big questions for the future is, how do we sustainably finance things that everybody benefits from, but nobody individually owns? And interestingly, that question exists far beyond software. Public transportation, public infrastructure has the same problem. Scientific research has the same problem. Education has aspects of the same problem. Even democracy itself has the same problem. Everybody benefits from functioning institutions, But those institutions only continue functioning if people contribute to them. And maybe this is where open source becomes more than a software story. It becomes an experiment in cooperation. For much of the 20th century, we often imagined two basic ways of organizing large projects. The state can organize them, or companies can organize them, but open source shows a third possibility. Communities can organize themselves around shared resources, not perfectly, not without hierarchy, not without money, not without rules, but nevertheless voluntarily and across institutional and national borders. And perhaps digital technology makes this easier than ever before. A developer in Zurich can work on something together with someone in Hanoi, Shanghai, Helsinki, or San Francisco. They don't need to live in the same country. They don't need to work for the same company. They don't even need to know each other personally. They need a shared technical language, a shared repository, a shared problem, and some shared rules. This also makes me think about globalization. We usually talk about globalization in terms of trade. Products moving between countries, factories, supply chains, capital, but maybe open source represents another form of globalization. Globalization of knowledge. An idea created in one country can be improved in another country and used in a third. Knowledge becomes less connected to geography, and perhaps this can bridge certain gaps. Not all of them. Access to education, computers, electricity, and the internet is still very unequal. Language barriers still exist, political restrictions still exist, and companies and governments still have interests that can conflict. But nevertheless, open source creates spaces where cooperation can happen despite those differences. That is remarkable. And perhaps there is a lesson here that extends beyond programming. We often assume that people will only work when somebody pays them. We assume that people cooperate because an organization tells them to. We assume that large systems need centralized control. Open source challenges all three assumptions. People sometimes contribute because they care. Communities can form without everyone belonging to the same organization. And enormous systems can emerge from distributed contributions. But open source also teaches us the opposite side. Good intentions alone are not enough. You need standards, you need governance, you need people who take responsibility, you need ways of resolving disagreements, and eventually, you often need money. That combination is what I find so fascinating. Freedom and rules, individual motivation and collective benefit, competition and cooperation, local people and global communities, companies and volunteers, all existing in the same ecosystem. And maybe democracy faces a similar challenge. A democracy cannot work simply because everybody is free. People also have to participate. They have to accept certain common rules. They have to tolerate disagreement. They have to contribute to institutions that benefit people they may never meet. And they have to accept that sometimes the outcome is not exactly what they personally wanted. In that sense, I think open source and democracy share something fundamental. Neither works automatically. Both depend on participation, both depend on trust, both require rules, and both require people who are willing to contribute something to a system that is larger than themselves. Perhaps that is the most interesting lesson of open source. Linux is fascinating technically, but maybe the human system behind Linux is even more fascinating. Thousands of people, companies, and organizations contributing over decades to something that nobody controls in quite the same way as a traditional commercial product. Something that crossed borders, something that became infrastructure, something that started in part because people simply wanted to build something. And today, much of our digital world depends on it. So when I think about open source, I no longer just think about free software. I think about a much bigger question. What can human beings build when knowledge is shared? Participation is possible, and people who have never met decide to solve a problem together. Maybe open source is an answer, and maybe we are still only beginning to understand where that answers can take us. Thank you for listening.